What's up everyone, Conrad Neufeld here, a nationally award-winning mortgage broker, and today we're talking about whether the present-day conservatives or present-day liberals are better for the housing market. And the answer partly depends on what you mean by better, so we'll explore that a bit. And to do that, we'll take a look at the various platforms that the political parties are currently running on here in Canada for this September election. Now I understand there are more than two parties, and for the sake of good discussion, we're not going to forget our friends at the NDP.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
I also acknowledge though that it is difficult to cover all of the platform points from all of the parties, especially if you're trying to keep the video concise enough that people watch it all the way through. And I typically like to have my video lengths at about 10 minutes. For that reason, this is the first time that I'm going to do a two-part video. For this first video, I'm going to do my best to cover the main key parts with an emphasis on what the parties did wrong and why. In the next video, we'll take a little bit more of a positive outlook and try to look at what the parties did right and why. That way, hopefully by the end of the two videos, you don't just know what the main platform points are, but you'll know what some of the consequences will be, both good and bad, if those platforms ever see existence. That being said, if you want to continue this discussion in the comments below, please do drop me a comment. My subscriber base is still small enough that I respond to or engage with, at least in some way, every single comment on every one of my videos. And while you're here, if you'd like to help me grow my channel, just like one of my latest subscribers, Amanda Stephenson, hit the bell notification so you're alerted when new videos come out and smash the subscribe button. Now let's get into it. I want to start with arguably one of the largest issues that I think are facing Canadians. And I put it in air quotes because I think a lot of Canadians, and particularly the media, have sunk their teeth into this issue and it's kind of taken on a life of its own. And that issue is housing affordability. Now you might be thinking right now, Conrad, there is no way that you're sitting there telling us that affordability isn't a real issue. I mean, clearly it is. And I'm not saying that. I do think it is an issue. But hear me out on this. I think affordability is less of the issue and more of a symptom of the much larger issue. The issue, as many people believe it to be, is that with housing prices so high, no one can afford to buy. And that is categorically false. In 2020 alone, there were 551,000 purchases that were conducted in that 12-month period. That was a new record all-time high. On top of that, these home buyers were qualifying at a rate much higher than a rate that they would ever realistically see during the term of their mortgage. They were qualifying at a rate of about 4.79% at the time and getting rates on their mortgages as low as 2% or less. Now, does that sound like an affordability crisis to you when you have the most amount of home buyers that you've ever had before and they're qualifying at a mortgage payment way higher than they would ever have to actually pay? It doesn't, right? And yet, there still is a crisis. So how can you have a record number of home buyers and simultaneously have a large number of home buyers that can't afford or get into a home? And the answer is that there are simply more people than homes. Canada is currently ranked last when compared to the other G7 nations in terms of housing per capita. That means the number of houses relative to the number of people that we have in our nation. In 2016, we were sitting at about 427 homes per 1,000 people, and currently 5 years later, we're sitting at about 424 homes per 1,000 people. We actually dropped in the last 5 years. But what does that actually tell us? Well, it tells us a few things. First of all, it tells us that if we wanted to catch up with the average housing per capita of the other developed countries like Japan, Germany, France, the UK, etc., that make up the G7, we'd have to build a whopping 1.8 million new homes on top of what we're already building. To further put that in perspective, over the last 5 years, we've built an estimated 964,727 homes. Meaning that if you and I were the ones that were elected into office and our goal was over the next 5 years to bring the housing per capita in Canada up to the G7 average, we would have to build at a rate of 286% faster than our current development. And that's just not realistic. But that being said, we also don't have to get to the G7 level for things to improve. So what do the Liberal, Conservative, and NDP platforms have to say about how they're going to resolve this supply problem? Well, first we have to provide a little bit of context and distinction between the numbers that the three parties released. For starters, the Liberals want to promote the development of 1.4 million homes in 4 years. The Conservatives want to do 1 million homes in 3 years, and the NDP want to do 500,000 homes in 10 years. You've probably heard these numbers before. However, what you may not know is that both the Conservatives and the Liberals have included the current number of homes already being built in a year into their numbers, whereas the NDP haven't. The second distinction is that both Conservatives and Liberals are factoring in office conversions and rehabilitation of existing inventory into their numbers, whereas the MDP, at least as far as currently, are saying that those 50,000 homes a year will be brand new inventory. So depending on what base build rate you want to base your numbers off, it means that the NDP want to build about 50,000 new units a year, the Conservatives want to bring roughly 47,000 new units a year through new builds and conversions and rehabilitation, and the Liberals want to bring about 60,000 new units a year also through new builds, rehabilitation, and office conversions. So how did these parties come up with their numbers? Well, I'm thinking what they did is they got a bunch of people in a room, and they had charts and graphs and donuts for days. And then they took those projected numbers and they pulled them out of their butts. Because they're all making shit up. The numbers literally mean nothing. I used to specialize in construction mortgages. Do you know how long it takes from the time a developer buys a piece of land, gets city approval, develops it, draws up the plan, has a builder build on it, and then the home buyer finally walks into that new home to start moving in? It's about 5 to 7 years. Home building is not some tap that you can just turn on and off at will. But I get it. Hey, it's an election. If a politician walks up and says, I'll solve your problem, Canada, but it's going to take me 5 to 7 years, but it'll never be this bad again, there are unfortunately enough people who will just say, nah man, give me the Band-Aid solution, save us in the short term. And unfortunately, even if that politician was able to solve it in the next 5 to 7 years, a new government could come in within then and undo everything that they had worked for. So that is why politicians tell you what they tell you, that they're going to solve your problem tomorrow and put more houses on the ground, even when they know they can't. What you should at least take comfort in, though, is that all parties seem to be relatively aware of the actual problem, and that is supply. Now, whether or not they deliver on their promises and not get in their own way, and remember this is true for all parties, because just because someone promises you something doesn't mean it's actually going to happen, this is where I tend to lose a little bit of faith in the present-day Liberal government. Their track record over the last 5-6 years hasn't been the best as far as keeping their promises, and in this current proposal, this current platform that they're running, there are some things that don't make a whole lot of sense when taking their whole agenda as a whole. For starters, the Liberals want to increase the flipper tax from 50% of the capital gains to 100% of the capital gains if you've owned the home for less than 12 months. And I know what some people are going to say to this. They're going to say, good, those greedy investors deserve to pay. But here's the problem. Most of the time, or most of the people that are flipping these houses are not large-scale institutional investors. They're your average everyday Canadian trying to make a little bit more money for their family. And if you remove the profit in doing it, if you remove the incentive to do it, then they're just not going to do it anymore. So the inevitable outcome of enacting this means that because far less people will be flipping homes, the government, A, won't be generating the tax revenue they thought they would be because there will be far less projects to tax, and B, many more homes will stay in a state of disrepair, a portion of these possibly in an unlivable state, because no one will be incentivized to invest their time and money into repairing it so that a new family can buy it and move in. So the Liberals are trying to increase the supply on one hand, but then increasing a tax that's going to reduce the supply on the other. Even the NDP, who traditionally have supported Trudeau throughout the last 5-6 years, thought that was a little bit too far and only increased their tax to 75% instead of the full 100%. Conservatives, on the other hand, have decided to keep that flipper tax at 50%. And I think that's the smarter play. At least that's the smarter play if you're looking to have more Canadians in homes in the shorter term. Now, the Conservatives' plan isn't exactly perfect either. One of the things that they are proposing is that they're going to encourage a 7 to 10 year fixed mortgage, presumably so that people could qualify for larger mortgages because there will be more stability in the longer term. And that actually does make sense. But if that's implemented poorly, there are some pretty nasty side effects that might come on an individual level. That being said, if implemented properly and certain safety checks are put in place, this could end up being a positive thing. And for that reason, we'll discuss this in more detail in part 2. Before we move on to part 2, though, we have to talk about the Liberals' proposed $1 billion rent-to-own program. Typically, the rent-to-own programs are most advantageous to the landlords, not the home buyers, which is why in all my years as a mortgage broker, I have been a big advocate against rent-to-own programs. And maybe sometime in a future video, I'll delve into why and all the reasons, all the pros and cons for rent-to-own programs. Putting that aside though, let's say that the government was able to find some utopian rent-to-own agreement that homebuyers were ready and eager to sign, and that the landlords were also willing to sign, which I doubt. Even then, in a best case scenario, this seems like a stealing from Peter to pay Paul kind of scenario. By having a rent-to-own program on that scale, you haven't really developed a new supply of anything. Yes, you've turned more renters into buyers, but you still have the same number of homes per 1,000 people. If anything, what you might end up doing by removing tens of thousands of rentals from the market is you might inevitably end up driving up rents in certain markets, especially if you plan on also increasing a tax that penalizes investors that will be bringing new rentals to the market. A $1 billion rent-to-own program is not going to suddenly make homes more affordable to buy, but it could, in theory, make rents go up. Either way, the landlords are going to be happy, because they're either going to be part of that rent-to-own program, in which case they're getting a check from the government, or they're going to be owning the properties as the rents go up.